Welcome. This workshop is about stop frame animation, and I will guide you through the whole process of creating a stop frame animation from the beginning, the shooting of individual still images and the recording of sounds, to the importing of these items into Adobe Premiere where we can animate them, and then also finally the last step, how you can export these animations in form of a standalone MPEG-4 video, for example, for online distribution in channels like YouTube or Vimeo, for example. I will use my cell phone, the Moto G5, as the photo camera, together with a tripod mount and a remote shutter button that allows me to take pictures without having to touch the camera. This is quite important because when you record a stop frame animation, when you record the individual images that are necessary, it is really important that you don't touch the camera in this process. The only thing that should really be moving and that should be changing over time is actually the object that you want to animate. In my case, this banknote that I'm going to use today. And everything else should be still. This also includes the lighting environment. And I use the studio setup with 2 desk lamps that I found at home on my desk as additional lights. So make sure that if you record your images and, for example, you're close by a window, that the overall ambient light is not changing over the course of a day when you're actually shooting this project, because this will be quite obvious later on in the animation of your images. I also have some other supplies here. This is some mounting putty that I got from a home improvement store that allows me to secure things safely to my work surface here. I also brought my sound recorder and a contact microphone, which I will be using for the sound recording part of this project. I will be showing you how to record some very basic scratching sounds that the banknote will create when it actually inches its way over the work surface. I think at this point we are ready to get started with our still image recording process. And I will just show you how to set up the equipment and then dive right into the recording of still images. Okay, so I have my equipment here for the image recording process. This is a clip, a cell phone clip with a tripod mount that you can attach your cell phone to. And I can't stress often enough how important it actually is to secure your recording device, your camera, your DSLR, your point-and-shoot camera, your cell phone, whatever you want to use as a recording device, to something that can be mounted onto a tripod, or at least try to prop it up with some books or any other objects that you may find in your apartment, so that the recording device is always stable. In this case, using this tripod mounting clip for the cell phone, I can actually attach this to the mounting plate of the tripod itself, like this. And then this will provide a very nice and secure connection. So again, you don't want the phone to move at all when you record your images. So that's why I'm also using this remote shutter right here that comes with the mounting clip, so that I can actually remotely trigger my photos and the camera is not moving, which to a certain extent would actually destroy the magic of the animated image when all of a sudden the frame around it will start to move as well. At this point, I'm actually now ready to take my pictures, and this is what I'm going to show you in the next section of this video. This process of animating your object in individual still images is actually a very important one in the process of creating your stop frame animation. You may realize that you have to go back and animate or reanimate some of the frames again and again until you get the timing and the animation speed just right because of the different time scales. Here we're actually working in real time, step by step animating the inching of this banknote across this work surface, whereas later in the computer we're speeding up that process and getting this kind of translation from one time scale to the other just right is actually a long and time-consuming process. If some of you are doing this for the first time, again, you may find yourself going back to reshooting some of these frames and experimenting a little bit with the timing and the individual changes from one shot to the next until you get this process just right. I'm now ready to record the sounds for my stop frame animation, and I'm going to use this contact microphone and the sound recorder that you've used before in this class. And what I'll do is I'll just quickly record the scratching sound or the shuffling sound of this banknote on the surface here, simulating this with my contact microphone. And while I'm doing this, what I want to do is create sounds of different lengths, so that I have a variety of different sounds that I can use to synchronize perfectly to my images later on in Premiere. I don't yet know exactly how long the still image sequences will be when I finally animate them, so how long each motion cycle will be. And so having the flexibility of sounds of different lengths is actually very nice in this case. I start out with a couple of shorter ones, and then also do some longer scratching sounds. And a few shorter ones at the end. All right, so that's it. Stop the recording. And now it's time to switch into the screen view so I can show you how to import all the materials that you've just recorded, the still images, the sounds, and then animate them using Adobe Premiere. And in the final step of this workshop, also exporting them and turning them into a standalone MPEG-4 movie. So in the screen view, we will start this project with an empty folder that I create on the desktop. I name this folder Stop Frame Animation. And then, as you can see, I have already downloaded the materials for this workshop, and you can find the URL from where you can download these files in the comment section of this video. So if you want to follow along in this workshop and you need some still images, you need some sound files, download this zip file, and then you can actually follow along with what I'm doing here on the screen. So once you've downloaded these files, and it may take a moment or so, this is 500 megabytes in size, the zip archive, you will double click this to unzip the files, and it will create a folder like this. At this point, you can get rid of the zip file, just put this into the trash, and then take this folder and drag and drop it into the folder we've just created on the desktop. If you double-click this folder and actually take a look at your materials, you'll see that there's one folder with still image files in there that you can use and that we will animate in Premiere. And then there's also a sound recording in form of an AFF file in there. So at this point, we are ready to start. And the first thing what we have to do is we have to create a new project in the software, and we will actually choose the folder that we just created on the desktop as our destination for this new project. So you will see this startup window, and here you can create a new project. So I'll click New Project. Make sure, hitting the Browse button here, that I'm on the desktop and that I specify the folder that I just created. Say Choose. And then I need to type in a name for this project, Stop Frame _ project, for example, and hit the OK button. You now see the user interface for Premiere, and I will go along as we actually create this project and explain a little bit more about all of these windows, how they relate to each other, and what their functionality is. The first window we need to be concerned about is actually the project window that you see here at the bottom left corner. And we will actually import all our media files into this window, and then later on when we create a new sequence, so that we also see a new timeline representation of our material. To the right of this window, we will see a representation of that sequence in here as well, and so forth. So, but before I actually import my files, it is very important to consider a few of the settings that I want to be working with in this project. One of the settings is actually the frame rate for the final video that I'm creating, and this is very important because when we import our still images, Adobe Premiere will give each of these images a default still image duration. We will actually need to set this in the very beginning before we actually import any of the images, so that this setting is applied to all of the still image files that we will be importing. And I can do that by going to Premiere Pro in the top left corner of the screen, go to my preferences in here, and then under Timeline, there is one setting. It's right here. It's called the Still Image Default Duration. And I guess by default this is set to 5 seconds. So each still image that I would import at this point would be imported with a duration of 5 seconds. Now this is actually quite long, and I would like to change this to a much shorter duration. In my case, this will be 2 frames. So I first change the units to frames, from seconds to frames, and then I put in the number 2, so 2 frames. And the reason for why I do this is that I know my final project will have a frame rate of 30 frames per second. I would actually use an effective frame rate of 15 frames per second. So if I know that I need 30 individual frames to fill 1 second, and I only have 15 frames to fill that, each of these frames need to have a duration of 2 frames to add up to the 30 frames per second. And the reason for why I choose 15 frames per second is that this is probably one of the lowest possible frame rates I can choose, so that images still look, when they're animated, they still look like the animation is fluid and it's not starting to stutter or to basically look jumpy in its animation. So that's important that before we import any of the images that we would like to use, we go to the preferences and set the still image default duration to 2 frames per second. Hit the OK button, and now I can actually import my media files into the project, and I can do that by simply double-clicking into the project window where it says Import Media to start. So I double-click in here. This will bring up my import window. I go to the desktop and stop frame animation folder, and then I import the AIFF file, and I also import the folder with the still image files. So I select both of these, I hold down the Shift key so I can select multiple files and folders in here, and then hit the import button, and that will get both of these, the still image folder and the sound file, into my project window. So you see, when I import folders, the folder structure is maintained in this process. And then open the folder, and then if you double click on any of these images, you see that they open in the source window, the top left corner here, which is kind of a preview window that you can use for previewing files, for making a selection of what component of the file or which time frame of the file you would like to use for your project. So all of this will happen in the source window. I also have another window which is to the right of the source window, which will reflect my changes that I create in the timeline here. We haven't created a timeline or a sequence yet, so there isn't anything in either of these two windows. But this is already the next thing that we can do, is we can create a new timeline, a new sequence, and whenever we create a new sequence, it is usually a good idea to know the settings for the sequence. Now, in most cases, you don't actually know the size of your still images that you've just recorded with your camera. In fact, if you want to find out, there's a way. If you go to this folder and then you just scroll a little bit over where it says, let's see, video info, you see that each of these files have a size of 4032 by 2268 pixels. Now this is a little bit too big for the final size of my sequence that I want to create in the end, which should be the regular HD resolution of 1920 by 1080 pixels. but I will introduce a step, an intermediate step in this project to show you how to scale down these images all at once, so you don't have to do an individual scaling operation for each one of them. So in the beginning, I'm not too concerned about the size. I will basically just create a new sequence that has the actual size of the still images that I'm importing. And I can do that without actually even knowing the size by taking this folder and dragging and dropping it onto this little icon that looks like a sheet of paper here in the bottom right corner of my project window. This will automatically create a new sequence. You see automatically all of the images that I've taken have been imported into this sequence. They are filling the whole screen. You see this in the program window or in my master window in the top right corner of the software interface. And I could, to a certain extent, already play them back and see a kind of an early preview of this animation. Now, something interesting happens here since the files are so big. And you want to play them back in an extremely short amount of time, basically each file only being visible for 2 frames per second on the, or basically just being visible for 2 frames on the screen, then it could happen just like what happened here, that all of a sudden your playback starts to stutter or that you start to skip some frames. And while you do that, you also see that there's this kind of yellow line that is being drawn into your timeline. This means that the files are so big that Premiere cannot play them back in real time. And in order for you to see them in real time and then later on also to, for example, synchronize some sound with them in real time, it is important to get rid of this yellow line and to basically have this real-time playback. And you can do so by rendering your files. So you just go to Sequence and then just say Render In to Out. And that will create a kind of a preview of this file that then you can play back in real time in order to make certain kind of editing decisions, in order to synchronize your images with sound files and so forth. So creating these render previews can be quite a helpful thing, especially if you have a jumpy playback of your files and you would like to fix that and you would like to see a very nice and smooth playback of your files. You also see in the process that whichever frames have already been rendered will be shown with this green bar on top of the sequence window, and whichever frames are still, so to say, iffy or cannot be played back in real time or could have some problems in terms of playback speed, they're being represented by this yellow line. It's just a few more seconds here, and so now everything is green in my timeline. The video plays back and you see how nicely everything is being animated already without too much of a stuttering, and the motion is actually quite fluid. Can at any point actually grab this playback head and kind of drag it back and forth in the timeline to kind of scrub through the video. If for whatever reason the video itself, the individual frames, would look too squished in this view, you can use the scroll bar here at the bottom of the window and just clicking and holding down on one of the either in or end points of the scroll bar, you basically zoom in temporarily into your timeline or zoom out like this. So that's possible as well. And then of course you can use the playback controls that are here in the program window in order to play it back as well. Okay, so this is the first step. So we've created a sequence that has the size of the original still image that you've taken without necessarily even knowing what that size is. Now in the second step, I want to create a sequence, and I want to use a technique called nested sequences, where I will take this original sequence and I will make it part of the second sequence that will have the right settings, which we can then use in order to scale all of these images down to the right size, and where we can also very precisely determine the playback speed of the sequence. So I do that by going to File, New, Sequence. And when I go to this window, on the left-hand side of this window, I see a list of all the different templates or presets I have for my sequences. I can of course always create a custom sequence, but in this case there is one already that is quite close actually to what we want to use in this project. We can find this template for the sequence in the digital SLR section. Open this. And in here we need to click on the 1080p folder on this little triangle in front of it. And then we need to choose the setting DSLR 1080p 30. And you see there's already a little bit of some explanation on the right hand side for this. The time base will be 30 frames per second. To be precise, it's actually 29.97 frames per second, which is the standard for the NTSC video system. But we can internally just consider this to be 30 frames per second. We will have a frame size of the true HD resolution, which is 1920 by 1080 pixels with a pixel aspect ratio of 1. So we have square pixels. And we won't have any fields, so we'll just have the full images for each of the frames, which is quite nice. So all of these settings are great. So I will just click the OK button, and that will create this new sequence in my stop frame project window. So I can name this final sequence underscore maybe 1080p, for example, so I know already the size of the sequence. And then what I can do is I can take my still sequence, and you see that as soon as you have more than one sequences, you can actually switch between these two sequences by clicking on the tabs in the in your timeline window, in your sequence window. And so with the final sequence selected, which is right now still empty, we'll actually go and have to find my stills sequence, which is in that folder. I just open that folder, click on that little triangle, scroll all the way down, and in here we'll find that sequence. It's called stills. You could also rename this. You could say, this is my original sequence. And then I take the sequence and I drag and drop it into the final sequence. So Premiere already realizes and says these two sequences, they don't match in their settings, which is obvious. So the original sequence being much larger in size, which you can see under video info here, much larger in size than my target, my final sequence. But we will actually adjust for these settings in just a second. So for now, we just say keep the existing settings. And then when you play this back, and we can actually zoom in a little bit, so I use the scroll bar at the bottom, just a little bit bigger, can scrub through this, you actually see that it almost looks like there isn't really anything happening, but it's just because the images are so big that we don't really see the banknote right now. We just basically see this horizon line and not too much else. So what I can do now in the next step is basically scaling the size of my original sequence that I have nested now in the final sequence. I can scale this down to the proper size, and so I can do that by selecting the video track. In fact, there is an audio track that came with it that doesn't have any sound in it, so this is, in fact, you can get rid of this if at some point if you like, maybe just do it right now. So selecting both of these, you would have to go to Clip, Unlink, and now you can select each one of them separately from the other. So just select the soundtrack, hit delete, because we will compose our own soundtrack in just a minute. And so this silence track wouldn't really do us too much good here for now. So at this point now I can click into the original sequence timeline representation. And then I would have to go to my source window again and go to the effect controls. So as you can see, there are many different tabs on top of that window, one of them being the effect controls. And in here, you can access different kind of settings for this clip. So one set of settings would be in the motion category. One would be in the opacity category. There's something about time remapping here as well. And the one that we're interested in is actually in the motion category. So I click on that little triangle in front of motion, and then I go to scale. And you can scale this interactively by just hovering your mouse over this number and then drag it left or right, and you already see the result in the program window. And so what I would like to do here is I would like to make it just the right size to fill the whole frame, which in this case would be 48% of the actual size of my video. So I need to scale the original sequence that I have dragged into my final sequence, so this one right here, need to scale this down to 48% in the effect controls window of my source window. Can also take a look at this again. You see there's this yellow line again, so we may experience at some point some playback jumps. So if you would like to get rid of those, again, go to Sequence, Render into Out, and that will render the settings for this new sequence that we have created, where we have applied this scaling operation to our original still images. Again, this is important in the next step, especially when we would like to take some sounds. We would like to synchronize the sounds in real time to the images as they are playing back. If the images are not playing back in real time, but the sound does, it will be very hard for you to synchronize both of these settings. Good. There's another little shortcut that I can quickly mention here. If you just briefly want to play back a section, you can actually use the space bar on your keyboard and then tap the space bar again to pause. So tap once, playback, tap twice, the playback pauses. Okay, so here is already our final sequence. It has the right size, it has the right frame rate, the right pixel aspect ratio. The only thing that's truly missing is now the soundtrack that we still have to create. And for that, I will go back to my project window. I can hide all the still images in the stills folder. These folders are actually called bins in the project window, referring to some 35 or 16 millimeter film bins that film editors used in the past actually to put together a film project in the editing process. These film strips were hung in these bins. So the same language, we're still using that for the digital files that we have here as well. But if I look at the project window again, I see that I have my contact microphone soundtrack in here. And if I double click on this, we'll also open in the source window. And you can already play this back. Let's just see what this sounds like. So these were the sounds that I created just by scratching with the contact microphone on the surface of the animation desk that I used for this project. And so you can hear that some sound a little bit better than others. There's some really screechy ones in here, and other sound. This one's a very nice one, for example. This one gets screechy again. So what I would like to do is I would like to find one of these sounds that actually corresponds with one of the motion sequences that I have. And so one sequence would certainly be right here, starting with a completely flat banknote, and then it actually goes to this stage where it would be all the way squished together as in the first part of the motion sequence, and then the second part where it deflates, so to say, again, it becomes flat. So if I just want to take a look at this one motion sequence here, so starting here, you can use the arrow keys on your keyboard to very specifically determine where a frame starts or ends. So the arrow left and the arrow right keys I'm using right now to specifically move through my sequence of still images. And then I actually like this sound here. It's pretty good. So maybe let's get started with that and just see what happens when I synchronize it with this one motion sequence. So if I want to separate only one sound in here, you can take this line of the playback head. You can place it very precisely where you want it to start. In fact, you can even zoom in a little bit more. It's the same strategy. You grab the endpoint of your scroll bar slider and start here. Now I just need to set an in point, and I do this by hitting the I key on the keyboard. So I click the I key. You see that everything before this in point is grayed out, becomes a little bit darker, so this won't be taken into consideration. And then need to set an out point right afterwards, and I do that by hitting the O key on the keyboard like this. So now I only have this one sound singled out, and what I can do now, I can go back to my project window and I grab the whole contact mic sounds sound file, and when I actually drag and drop it into my sequence here, it will only take the part that I have selected with my in and my out point. So that's very important to remember. It's not the whole file. And you also don't destroy the whole file by setting this in and out point, that now all of a sudden it's only that one sound that remains. But it's basically a marker or a link that is being created that links only to that one sound instance that will be used here in our timeline. So I do this and I grab this from the project window and then drag and drop it in my timeline into the audio track. You see here A1. And the nice thing is that it actually snaps to my playback head. So wherever the playback head is in my timeline, this is where the sound will snap to. And then you can already play this back and see there's just this one sound in here so far, but let's see. Yeah, and so this sounds pretty good. And so what I can do is I play back this one sound, then I make sure there's the next animation sequence, the next movement sequence that started. I can take that sound again, drag and drop it here. Okay, one more right here. And so I can work my way through the animation sequence like that, putting individual sound files that correspond to or that are synchronized with my movement. So I already have 3 of these, so let's just listen to what this sounds like over a longer period of time. Yeah, and this is really not too bad actually, so I think I can just keep going with this. So just need to make sure I always have the starting point for my sound, which will be right when the file is flattened out, and then I drag and drop my sound files there. And so I can also make my way backwards, so I just scrub through my timeline now in a backwards fashion. Here, there's another one right here. And of course you can experiment, so if this one sound instance sounds maybe not quite right, then you can go back to your sound files and grab other ones. So maybe this one sounds a little bit better, so you could try that one out, or any of the other ones. So that's why we also in the recording process recorded these sounds using different lengths, different durations already, so that we have some flexibility now when we want to synchronize our sounds with the still images that we're using in this project. Here's another movement sequence. So right here, and I'm almost done. There's one right here. Okay. From the beginning, it seems to be moving a little bit faster. So you see this by the individual spaces in between these sounds. So there's an acceleration in the beginning, then it's a more regular speed here, and then also a little bit more of an acceleration at the end, which is quite nice. It almost suggests that there's a certain kind of anxiety to make it to the other side of the screen, or a certain kind of goal that it wants to reach there. So a certain kind of intention that is being expressed with this timing that is distributed in a slightly less linear way here. So let's play this back and just see how all of this looks and sounds together. Yeah, and I think this is pretty good. So I like this quite a bit. So I'll just play it one more time just to be sure I really like it. So if you wanted to break it up and say, okay, in the middle here, it actually takes a little bit longer for this process. Maybe I want to use a slightly different sound. You can actually listen to some here. That sound may be a little bit different. Wonder if I get lucky and I find a good one. Still very fast. Yeah, so maybe let's try this one here. So go in and want to get rid of, there's this tiny click in the beginning here, so I don't want to include that. So I set my in point, hitting the I key right here, going to the out point, hitting the O key, and get rid of this one here. Actually, I first move my playback head to the beginning. And so if it doesn't snap to the beginning of a track, sometimes this can happen, hold down the Shift key on the keyboard and it will actually do that for you. So you see how there's this tiny arrow that all of a sudden starts appearing, and it will actually snap to the beginning of your track. You can click on your sound snippet here and then hit the delete key. And then since I set a new in and out point here, can take the same file, drag and drop it in here, but it will have a different sound snippet now since I adjusted this. You also see that all the other sound snippets that I've already used before that, they will stay the same. So by changing the in and out point in exactly the same sound file here, won't change the in and out points retroactively for all the files or all the sound clips that I've already used. So it's only the new ones that I drag into the timeline that will be changed. So let's just quickly listen to that. So that might be nice because there's just also a little bit of some variety in the sounds of the little banknote inching its way across the screen here. So yeah, so I'm pretty happy with this. So the last step, if I consider this my final project for this little experiment, then I would need to export this and I would need to generate a standalone video file, which will be in the MPEG-4 format that I can play back without having to use the Premiere software. So I can use VLC, can use QuickTime, I can use Windows Media Player and so forth. And I can also use this file to upload it to YouTube if you wanted to distribute it in online channels. So I do that by specifying to the software which time frame I would actually like to export here. If you only have a simple project like I do, you wouldn't have to do that. It would just automatically take whatever is in the timeline, whatever is in your sequence window. But imagine that you have some other clips in here that maybe didn't make it into your final project. You just have them sitting around in your timeline, and you don't know if you wanted to use them at some point or not. In the end, they didn't get used. These would all be included in the final project as well. So since we don't want any surprises like this to happen, what I suggest is basically also always create in and out points in your sequence window and then just exporting your sequence between the in and the out point. So I do that by going to the beginning of your sequence, which is also the beginning of my video track and my soundtrack. I hit the I key on the keyboard again. And then I go to the end, just right here, and you may have to hold down the mouse, the Shift key on your keyboard. And if you want to see the last frame, just go one frame in by using the left arrow key on your keyboard, and then hit the O key on your keyboard to set this as the out point of your composition. So now you see between the in point and the out point, I have my video and my audio file selected. And I'm now ready to export this as a standalone video. If in the meantime you change your view to any of the other windows, or you change your selection to any of the other windows, and you see whichever window is selected has this blue border around it, make sure that before you actually do the next step that I'm going to show you, that the sequence window has the blue line of selection around it. So you basically get that by just simply clicking into the window. And so we want the sequence window to be selected. So the blue line needs to be around the sequence window. And then I would go to File, Export, Media. This will open the export window, and I will just briefly go over the different settings that you have to double check in here. The first thing that you would need to do is choose the right kind of format for your export, and you probably have to uncheck the match sequence settings if this is still selected in your case. Probably in my case it has already remembered these settings from previous projects, so they all look good right from the beginning, but in your case you may have to uncheck this, and then make sure that under format you have the H.264 compressor selected. This is actually a compression algorithm for a very nice MPEG-4 video. The size will be relatively small and the quality will still be relatively high for that. So it's a very nice combination of features that you would like to have for your final movie. The next thing that you need to check is the output name. This is basically the name under which you're saving this project, and if you click on the name, you can open an export window that allows you to choose the folder to which you will export this animation. And so I would like to export it, of course, in my stop frame animation folder on the desktop. And I can just give this a name, Fabian's first animation underscore 1080p. So I remember even after this point that this is an HD 1080 resolution that I'm using here. This will be saved automatically as an MPEG-4 video file. And if you uncheck the hide extension, you see that this will be the extension that is added to the file. Hit the save button, so this updates, and we want to export both video and audio, so we need to make sure that the check marks are set for both of these fields. Now in the next section down here you have different tabs again, and so the two that we would need to check are the video tabs and the audio tabs that correspond to these two check marks. So under video you need to make sure that the width and the height are 1920 for the width and 1080 for the height. If any of these settings are grayed out and you can't click into them, if you would like to change them, if they're anything else than these settings, you may have to uncheck this little checkbox here behind the corresponding setting, and it will give you access to the actual numbers or the actual setting that then you can change. So in my case, though, this is fine. So 1920 by 1080 is good. The frame rate should be 29.97. Field order is progressive, so we have full frames. The aspect ratio for the pixels is square. TV standard NTSC, and the rest of these, here we have a profile, it's called main, and 4.1 under level. So the most important ones here are basically the width and the height, frame rate, field order, and the aspect ratio that all need to be exactly like I have them in here. And then it's also important is the bitrate setting, which determines the actual quality and the compression rate at which the MPEG-4 compressor is applied to this video. So you can imagine basically compare this to a kind of a JPEG image setting where you also have different quality settings from low on the left-hand side of these sliders to very high on the right-hand side of this slider. And in this case, it's just a little bit different in that we first have to choose a bitrate encoding setting. CBR would be constant bitrate. This means there's the same amount of data that's being generated for each of the frames of the animation, disregarding of the content of the frame. So you can imagine a frame like this, in which not a lot is happening, would take up the same amount of space as a frame like this, where there's already more happening because there's this banknote that has a little bit more detail to it. It's not uniformly green and so forth. So in the constant bitrate setting, all of these frames would be given equal attention. A slightly smarter way to compress your video files is, however, to choose a variable bitrate compression. And you see that there's a 1-pass and a 2-pass setting, and I would always, if time permits, recommend that you use the 2-pass setting, because with 2 passes, it will use 1 pass first to analyze the video, and then in the 2nd pass, it will fine-tune this analysis and really compress the file as much as possible while maintaining the best possible image quality. So set this bitrate encoding to VBR2 pass. Of course, having 2 passes in the compression process or the encoding process will also take double as much time as only having 1 pass, for example. So calculate that there's a little bit more time involved in this. Since we're working with very small time frames here, so my overall length is, after all, it's only 6 seconds for this animation, so it still won't matter too much. However, if you had, let's say, a half an hour of footage in here, this would be a significant increase of the time that is consumed in finally encoding this video. And then we just have these 2 settings here, the target bitrate and the maximum bitrate. And I would say with the pixel size for our frame, which is 1920 by 1080, and 30 frames per second frame rate, the target bitrate should be probably somewhere around between 12 and 15 megabits per second. 15 would already be on the upper end here. So let's say 12 megabits for the target bitrate, and then if there's a frame that needs an extraordinary amount of data to successfully capture its content, let's say we can go up to 15 megabits per second here. You'll see that both of these sliders will actually result in a final estimated size of the file in all. And so, of course, the higher these settings here, the higher the size of the final file. You may ask, why don't we just crank this up all the way to, I don't even know if this is 100 or 50 or whatever the setting here is. This would be overkill. It would just create a file that's too big, and it wouldn't necessarily result in too much more of an improvement of the images. Keep in mind, though, that this is just one possible frame size. There's other projects where you may actually need to output something at 4K or even larger, 10K and so forth. And for these larger sizes, of course, you may need some much larger target and maximum bit rates as well. All right, finally, we also need to check the audio setting, and under audio format, we need to make sure that this is AAC, the codec that we use here. The sample rate should be 48 kilohertz, so 48,000 hertz. Stereo channels, we want to set the audio quality to high, which is the best, and then the bit rate also to the maximum, which is 320 kilobits per second. So not too many settings here, and they pretty much by default should already be set to these individual settings, but if they are not, make sure that you have these settings exactly as they are in this window here. All right, and then we are ready to export this project. So we just hit the export key, and this will start to render our project. So this is our first pass, and as I said before, having a variable bitrate 2-pass encoding will take twice as much time as the 1-pass encoding, but it will also result in a slightly better image quality and a slightly lower or smaller file size in the end. So this is the desirable setting. You see that this already takes a little bit, even for 6 seconds here, since there's a little bit of some rescaling that needs to happen and synchronization with the sounds that we put with the project. But when this process is done, you basically have a standalone video file that you can send to your friends, you can upload to Vimeo or YouTube, that doesn't need Premiere anymore in order to be played back, which is going to be actually quite nice and convenient. So the window automatically disappears when the export is successful. So I can just save this project one more time. You can go to File, Save, or hit the Command S on the Macintosh on the keyboard, save this project. We can then exit Premiere and look video that we have just exported, which is right here, and then play it back. So since I'm on the Macintosh, I basically just need to select this video, I hit the space bar, and it will automatically play back in a preview window. Okay, so that's the file. You are now officially done with your first stop frame animation project. Congratulations if you made it to this point. And if you actually want to know how I created that small introduction sequence where the banknote is crawling on the animation surface behind me, in the beginning of this video, check out my chroma keying and a green screening workshop, the link of which I also provided in the comments for you guys.